Hi, welcome to Right to the Top. I'm Adam. In today's video, I want to talk to you about a particular grammar point, but it is very, very important to the essay section of your IELTS TOEFL writing section. And the reason it's very important is that even though it's a grammar point, it can very much affect your cohesion and coherence score because it can be very confusing to a reader. And many of you are making a mistake with this particular grammar point. So what we're going to look at are the demonstrative pronouns. That's this, that, these, those, it, and they. And I'm going to explain to you what their function is, how to use them, and then I'm going to show you how many people are making mistakes and how this can be confusing to the reader. Okay? So we're going to start with the basics. This and these, singular and plural, we talk about something that is near. Now, when we're speaking, we can say something is near, we can point to it. In writing, near basically means the previous sentence or something very closely associated with what you're writing in the next sentence, right? It could also be nearness in terms of time. And I'll give you an example of that as well. Obviously, that and those, something a little bit distant or separated. There's other things between the noun and the pronoun that you're using to replace it with. Or it could be some separation in terms of time. And again, you'll see an example. Now, it and they, technically these are subject pronouns. We can use them as subjects in a sentence. We can use all of these as subjects in a sentence, but it and they are technically subject pronouns, but they can also be used as demonstrative pronouns. They can also stand in place of a noun mentioned before. Again, very important, the function of a demonstrative pronoun. To point to previously mentioned things, ideas, situations, etc., so as to avoid repeating them. All of these words are pointing to something that was already mentioned before. Now, in writing, this could be very confusing if it's not clear what the pronoun is pointing to. But you must use pronouns. If you don't use pronouns, it means you're repeating nouns, you're repeating phrases, you're repeating clauses when you don't need to. And that's going to affect your cohesion and coherence score. Okay? So we're going to look at some examples so you'll understand what I mean. Many schools nowadays include coding classes as part of each school's core curriculum in the belief that coding is an essential skill students need to master if students are to find success in the employment markets of the future that will certainly require this skill. Now, that's a lot of stuff to say, a lot of repetition as well. Many schools nowadays include coding classes as part of each school's core curriculum. So I have school, twice. Coding classes in the belief that coding, so I have coding and coding again, okay, is an essential skill students need to master if students, twice again, are to find success in this skill. So I have skill and skill. So I have all these words being repeated. And again, technically, this is not wrong. Grammatically, there's no problem with it. In terms of reading, it makes it very boring for a reader. It makes it a little bit too many words. And again, if you're writing the IELTS or TOEFL, this is going to cost you points because it shows the grader you don't have enough command of the language to avoid doing something like this that just isn't necessary. Now, how would I fix this? So let me get rid of all these so you can see it. Many schools nowadays include coding classes as part of their curricula. So there, again, I'm pointing to the schools. Now, because I went with the plural there, I have to change the curriculum to curricula. Make sure that your numbers match. If you left this as curriculum, then it doesn't agree with the pronoun, which is a plural pronoun. I forgot to mention this, it, they, their. That's another pronoun I forgot to mention as the adjective. In the belief that, now, this or it is an essential skill. This, coding, or it, coding. Both of these are okay. You can use one or the other. How will you choose? Well, you'll see if you're using the other one somewhere else. You don't want to use pronouns too much or too often either, right? So both of these are acceptable. If essential skills students need to master, if they being students, no need to say students twice, use a pronoun. Success in the employment markets of the future that will certainly require it, the skill. Now, it has to be very clear, that's the main thing. In this particular sentence, all the pronouns very clearly point to something, like something very nearby. So it's very easy to follow because everything is following the same thing. If you think that they refers to anything other than students, you have a bit of a problem, right? In this case, it's very clear because that's the last noun mentioned. Generally, the pronoun will point back to the last noun mentioned in the sentence or in the phrase or in the clause. But sometimes that doesn't work, okay? Now, another thing you have to remember that skill can't find success. Curricula can't find success. Only the students can find success. So logically, they can only refer to students. But this is not always the case. It's very important that it's very obvious what they're pointing to. Following the financial crisis, so I'm reading this sample now. Following the financial crisis of the previous decade, all banks were consequently subject to strict new regulations meant to prevent future abuses. Many of these failed over time. Now, you're looking at the sentence and you're thinking, okay, yeah, no problem. But there is a problem. What does these refer to? What is it pointing at? Is it pointing to banks? Is it pointing to regulations? Or is it pointing to abuses? I have 3 plural nouns preceding it in the sentence before. So obviously, I can't very easily think what these are that failed. Now, I know it's not abuses because abuses, they can't fail. They don't match this verb. So I take that out. That still leaves me with banks or regulations. Banks can fail. Regulations can fail. They can fail to do what they were meant to do, what they were introduced to do. So how would I fix this? When you have a situation where your preposition, your pronoun is meant to replace something, if there are 2 things and you want to be very clear, just repeat. Still use the pronoun, but repeat the noun. So many of these banks failed over time. Okay, the banks that I refer to. So these banks are actually these banks, all banks. Or these regulations are the ones that are meant to prevent. It doesn't matter that if you're repeating it with the pronoun, because then you're just emphasizing it. It's actually adding strength to your writing, okay? If you don't introduce them again, you're asking the reader to make that assumption and never ask your reader to assume anything. Here's another one. I'm going to show you a couple of things here. Advertisers believe that the more a consumer is exposed to a specific brand, the more likely he or she is to develop a preference for that brand. So here's that, and then I have to use that because brand by itself, if you say for a brand, then you're talking about any brand. Back to specifying that the same brand I'm talking about, the one that has the exposure. So I'm using that to emphasize. Now, this is why, or that is why. Now, technically, the correct one is this, because I'm referring to the immediate thing, the thing that is right near me in the previous sentence. The correct pronoun here is this, but many native English speakers often use that. That is why. Doesn't matter the situation, they always say that is why, especially in spoken English. This probably won't affect you too much in the writing, and the IELTS or TOEFL graders won't really care. Just so you know, this is correct. That is common. Okay. This is why it is nearly impossible, and I'll talk about the it here later, to navigate through the real or cyber world without being constantly bombarded by ads. Now, it is also why, this is also why. Now, this is the same as this. But because I already used this here, I can go and use it here. I've already established we're talking about the reasons for something. I can use it the second time, I can use it, or I can use this twice. Avoid using twice because it's just a little bit boring, right? If you can have other options, use other options. It is also why companies pay premium prices for commercial slots during high-profile events, such as the Super Bowl or World Cup, when that is magnified. Now, here's where a lot of people have a problem. They're using that, and they're using it correctly. The problem is, I don't know what that is. Now, here, we're talking about high exposure to something, right? And we're talking about magnified, means made bigger. But I don't know what is being magnified, because you are obviously referring to the exposure here. Actually, let me just switch colors here so you guys can. You're referring to the exposure here. But this is way too far. Too many things in between. Too many things that could point to between exposure and magnified. So you have to reintroduce it. When that exposure is magnified, when you have a lot of separation between the nouns, reintroduce the noun so the reader doesn't have to try to figure out what you're talking about, okay? And this is a very common mistake in the writing section, and you're going to lose points for that. Another example. Children's attitudes towards education can reflect many insights into their home lives. Among these are their parents' own. Now, here, these, you're asking, what does these refer to? Is it attitudes or is it insights? Well, let's read a little bit more. Among these are their parents' own upbringing and education level. These are not attitudes, okay? These are the things that we can learn by observing the children. So it's obvious that they are insights. I don't need to introduce it again, especially since they're actually quite close to each other. If it's very obvious, no problem. If it's not obvious, reintroduce the noun that you're replacing. Thus, teachers need to pay attention to their students' approaches to homework. Now, I could say there only, but again, it's probably obvious that it's the student because it's the teachers, but technically there could be the parents, because I mentioned parents, even though I didn't use it as a focused noun. I'm not talking about the parents. But again, for a reader reading quickly, this could be a little bit confusing. Better to just reintroduce the students because there's a bit of a, where is it? There's a bit of a separation between the two nouns. Reintroduce it, move on. And here you see there is obviously the students because we've already reintroduced it here. If you have a lot of stuff, or if you have quite a separation between the first noun and the pronoun use, reintroduce and then go on with the pronouns again after that. Okay? I hope that's a little bit clear. I know it could be confusing sometimes. Okay, so now what we have sometimes is a big problem when you're starting a new paragraph. Now you have to remember that the reader, when the reader starts a new paragraph, he or she has already forgotten the details of the previous paragraph. They're not thinking about it. Any noun that you want to reintroduce in the next paragraph, you have to specifically say. So let's say in the same essay, the second paragraph, beginning with "on the other hand," these may simply be a student's own idiosyncrasies. Now, it is very unclear what these refers to. To the writer, it's very obvious that it's the attitudes mentioned before. But to the reader, those attitudes, that was in the first sentence of the last paragraph. That's way out of their minds. You need to bring that back. On the other hand, these attitudes may simply be the student's own idiosyncrasies, etc. Idiosyncrasies, like little strange characteristics. Not strange, just particular to them. Doesn't have to be strange. Now, another very common problem. Don't confuse pronouns, especially that, with the relative pronoun that, which begins an adjective clause or a noun clause, etc. The CEO was finally forced to admit that was why he doctored the books. That, beginning the noun clause, that is a pronoun pointing to something mentioned in the previous sentence. You can use that. They have different meanings, different functions. Don't get confused. The auditor discovered the manipulation, which is what led to the CEO's admission. Make sure that if you're beginning an adjective clause, you have the comma and you have which. Don't use that after a comma to start an adjective clause, okay? The auditor discovered the manipulation. That is what led to the CEO's admission. So remember I mentioned you can have separation of time. Here I could use that instead of this, even though it's in the previous sentence. We're talking about the action which happened in the past before another action in the past, right? The auditor discovered the manipulation. After the discovery, it led to the CEO's admission. So you have two actions separated by time, and that's why I'm using that to reflect the separation. Be very careful with the subjunctive mood. It is important that something happens. It is important to do something. This it and this it are both subjects. Subject pronouns, they're preparatory subject, means whatever comes from that onwards or from to onwards is the subject. We put it at the end, we use it as a subject. But a lot of people forget that. It is important because. As soon as you have because, this is no longer a subjunctive. This is an adverb clause, and this is your independent clause. So it is pointing to something. If I don't know what that it is, the whole sentence falls apart. I'm confused. You're losing points. Okay? Let's look at some last examples, and we'll wrap it up. So new teachers need to keep certain ideas in mind, such as teacher-student relationships. This is your first opening sentence. Let's look at the next sentence. It is important that teachers have a good rapport with their students, as this leads to. No problem. This it is preparatory subject. Your subject is that teachers have a good rapport is important. Subjunctive, okay. It is important for teachers to listen to their students so that they can maintain good relations in the classroom. This it is also not a problem. Now, some of you may think, well, what about they? Is this teachers or students? Okay, so how are you going to fix that? It is important for a teacher to listen to his or her students so that everyone can maintain, etc. Just change the sentence. Make one singular, make one plural, and then use the appropriate pronoun to make sure there's no confusion. Now, it is important because it creates a more harmonious and productive environment. What is it? There's nothing in this sentence that I can point to as it. And therefore, this sentence does not work. The reader is confused. You're losing points in your coherence and cohesion score. Okay? Now, if you have any questions about this, I know there's a lot of information here, maybe a bit confusing. Please ask me in the YouTube comments section. I'll be happy to answer. If you like the video, please give me a like. Please subscribe to my channel and come back for more grammar, writing, vocab, test tips, lessons, etc. See you again soon. Bye-bye.